Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic that has had, well, a huge impact on how we think about education. Emotional intelligence. You sent us a really thought-provoking paper from 2000 published in Educational Psychology Review that takes a critical look at the research behind all the policies surrounding this idea.
That's right. This deep dive is designed to help you understand the scientific basis for emotional intelligence in education, specifically as it was understood, around the turn of the millennium. We're going to explore the connection, or perhaps the less than solid connection, between that research and the educational policies that were becoming widespread at the time. Our aim is really to figure out if those policies were actually built on a strong scientific foundation back then.
And it's incredible how quickly emotional intelligence went from being this sort of niche academic term to, well, a household name. After Mayer and Solovey formally defined it in 1990, it just exploded, didn't it?
It really did. Daniel Goleman's 1995 book, Emotional Intelligence, was a massive bestseller, and then Time magazine put it on their cover.
Yeah, that Time cover.
It felt like this concept just, took over the public imagination.
Completely.
Interestingly, a few key claims from Goleman's work really grabbed people's attention, especially educators. He highlighted things many were already worried about. Increasing issues with rudeness, irresponsibility, even violence in society and schools.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the second big idea, the one that really resonated, was that science had supposedly found this direct link between high emotional intelligence and pro-social behaviors, things like empathy, cooperation. That was a super appealing message for anyone working with kids.
Absolutely. And maybe the most captivating claim of all was that emotional intelligence was as powerful, maybe even more powerful, than traditional IQ in predicting how successful someone would be in life. I mean, that notion really challenged a lot of conventional wisdom.
It certainly did. You could see the effects almost immediately in the education world. I remember reading that Margaret Scherer, writing in Educational Leadership in '97, pretty much echoed Goleman's point, saying emotional intelligence was a more reliable predictor of success than IQ. That's a pretty big statement from an educational leader.
If we connect this to the bigger picture for you, you can see how this enthusiasm led to real policy changes. By 1997, there were already at least 22 formal socio-emotional learning programs being tried out in schools.
Wow, 22 already?
Yeah, and it wasn't just individual schools. Whole systems were jumping on board. Rhode Island, for instance, developed a statewide plan to integrate emotional learning across all their social, health, and education programs.
Which brings us to the central question we really need to delve into for you today. Does it actually make sense for schools to base policy on boosting emotional intelligence? The paper you shared raises some important red flags, and it even draws that comparison to the self-esteem programs in California back in the late '80s, early '90s.
Ah, yes, the self-esteem movement.
Right. Those programs were rolled out on a massive scale without much solid proof they'd actually work, and, they were largely seen as a disappointment later. It makes you wonder if the emotional intelligence push was maybe heading down a similar path.
This raises a really fundamental question about the very groundwork of these policies, doesn't it? To truly understand this, we need to look back at how the whole idea of emotional intelligence even made its way into educational policy in the first place.
Okay, so let's break this down. The term emotional intelligence wasn't totally new in the '90s, was it? The paper mentioned some earlier uses in academic circles.
That's correct. There were mentions here and there going back even to the mid-60s, but without a clear, agreed-upon definition or a real research focus. For instance, Greenspan in '79 talked about it almost like a developmental stage within a specific theory, but it wasn't a widely adopted view.
And then there was Wayne Payne's dissertation in the mid-'80s. The paper calls it close to a first definition. What did he suggest?
Interestingly, Payne proposed that emotional intelligence was a sort of basic intelligence, dealing specifically with emotions. He suggested feelings were factual, emotional meanings were these things called felt meanings, and emotional truths were about our relationships and solving emotional problems.
Felt meanings, emotional truths. That does sound a bit abstract. Did Mayer and Solovey manage to make it more concrete in their work?
It really did. Starting in 1990, Mayer and Solovey provided a much more concrete and, importantly, testable definition. They viewed emotional intelligence as a genuine intelligence, the ability to process emotional information accurately and efficiently. This includes the capacity to perceive, understand, and manage emotions.
So thinking of emotions almost like a kind of data, that actually makes sense. The paper mentions their idea of emotional meanings as signals about relationships. Could you unpack that a bit?
Certainly. If we connect this to the bigger picture for you, Mayer and Salavi argued that emotional expressions, like anger, have deep evolutionary roots. They serve as warnings across species. In humans, these feelings communicate vital info about our connections not just with other people, but with groups, objects, even our own sense of self, like guilt telling us we've messed up.
Right, and from that foundation, they developed their four-part model of EI abilities. Let's walk through those.
Yeah,
First is perceiving emotions.
precisely. This is about being able to pay attention to and accurately identify feelings. The paper gives that relatable example of a mother noticing her son's, uneasy posture and correctly figuring out he's done something he shouldn't have.
Okay, got it. Second is integrating emotion and thought.
Yeah.
What does that look like practically?
This is about using your own emotions to inform your thinking and how you communicate. So, in that example, the mother might share a story about a time she was in a similar jam with her mother, using her past feeling to encourage her son to open up.
That's a great illustration. Okay, third ability, understanding emotions.
This goes deeper than just recognizing emotions. It's about reasoning with them, grasping their complexities, how they mix and change. So when the son confesses to speeding, the mother might try to understand the whole cocktail of her fear for him, her anger about the consequences, and his own shame.
Makes sense. And finally, the fourth ability is managing emotion.
Yeah, this covers the skills needed to deal effectively with both your own feelings and other people's feelings. In the speeding ticket scenario, the mother has to balance empathy for her son with the need to set boundaries and maybe discipline him, considering both the immediate emotions and the long-term relationship.
The paper also mentions that Mayer and Salavi initially described someone high in EI as having certain character traits: well-adjusted, genuine, warm, persistent, optimistic.
Interestingly, yeah, while their early work touched on those character outcomes, the core of their theory really stayed focused on emotional intelligence as a set of cognitive abilities. And that distinction becomes super important later when we talk about how the concept got popularized and, well, maybe misinterpreted.
Right. Because around the same time, we also had the growth of character education and socio-emotional learning, or SEL, in schools. Can you give us a quick rundown of those?
Sure. Character education, which has older roots, focuses on developing moral character, responsibility, values like fairness, honesty. Socio-emotional learning, or SEL, is a bit more recent and shares similar values: self-awareness, caring, respect, responsibility. But it also really emphasizes the specific skills for navigating the social world, like communication and self-control.
And the paper points out that both approaches share this fundamental belief that personality isn't fixed, right? It can be shaped by learning.
Exactly. Educators in both camps believe they could actively cultivate these positive traits and skills in students.
So how did this academic idea of EI, with its focus on cognitive abilities, get tangled up with these broader educational movements focused on character and social skills?
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for you. The paper points to the role of the Fetzer Institute, a foundation focused on mind-body-spirit stuff. They gave funding to Daniel Goleman, who was a science journalist, specifically to connect his work on emotions and the brain with education.
Ah, the funding connection.
Right. The Institute also set up meetings between EI researchers and educators who were actively looking for new approaches. This eventually led to organizations like KCEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning.
So Goldman really became the key bridge between the academic research and what happened in schools.
Absolutely. While Mayer and Salavi's research was getting more focused on EI as mental abilities, Goleman broadened the concept, really broadened it. To link EI more directly to character development, he basically just equated the two. He presented EI as this collection of personality traits: optimism, resilience, motivation, essentially saying it was character. He argued that focusing on these emotional competencies would create caring communities.
That sounds like a subtle but actually pretty huge shift. He took the potential results of having high EI, like being optimistic, and kind of folded them into the definition itself.
Precisely. And this broadening had a massive impact. Emotional intelligence became this, catch-all phrase for anything related to motivation, emotions, or just having good character. The problem, as the paper really emphasizes for you, is that this super broad definition lost its clear meaning. It could even include traits that might sometimes contradict each other.
So if it became this vague, kind of fuzzy concept, why did educators find it so appealing for policy?
Well, there were a few things going on. First, the public just accepted the idea really quickly. Emotional intelligence being key for learning and behavior, it just felt right to a lot of people.
It has that intuitive appeal.
Exactly. Second, Policymakers totally grabbed onto the idea that EI predicted success, fueled by those early, highly publicized claims we talked about. Third, there was this perception that you could easily see EI. Good behavior meant high EI, temper tantrums meant low EI. It seemed observable. And finally, there is the strong belief that you could actively teach it, foster it, improve it in kids through school programs.
It sounds like these beliefs were largely shaped by the popular science writing, maybe more than by digging into the actual, more complex scientific research itself.
That's a key insight for you. The paper suggests that connection between the science and the policy was mostly filtered through these more accessible journalistic accounts.
Okay, so we've seen how EI became popular in education policy, but now we need to dig into the real question for you. What was the actual scientific justification for putting it in the curriculum? The paper raises some really critical points here.
Yes, the paper tackles those assumptions policymakers seem to be running with, that EI is the foundation of SEL, that it's a top predictor of success, that it's central to character, and that it's easily taught. Let's start with the first one. Does EI truly underpin socio-emotional learning?
The paper says, theoretically, it kind of makes sense. If EI is about understanding and managing emotions, that seems like a necessary base for learning social and emotional skills. But there's a big but here, isn't there?
Interestingly, the crucial point here for you is the need for emotional intelligence to be a valid, well-defined model of an actual intelligence. Otherwise, as the paper cleverly puts it, saying EI underlies SCL is like saying algebraic intelligence underlies studying algebra. It doesn't mean much unless algebraic intelligence is a real thing. We need solid evidence for distinct, coherent abilities making up this emotional intelligence.
And the paper highlights Mayer and Salavi's ability-based definition as the most established and scientifically supported model we had back then.
Exactly. Their model, with those 4 branches we discussed, has been the main focus of academic research. Now, there are related ideas, like Gardner's interpersonal intelligence or Sternberg and Caruso's pragmatic intelligence, but Mayer and Solovy's framework is the one that really generated the empirical work.
They see intelligence as this kind of hierarchy, right? With general intelligence, G at the top. Where does EI fit in?
Mayer and Solovy propose EI as a somewhat distinct part of general intelligence, sitting alongside verbal and spatial intelligences, and then branching into more specific abilities.
And how do they actually measure this ability-based EI? The paper mentions ability tests.
Yes, the most direct way is through tests asking people to solve emotion-related problems. The Multi-Factor Emotional Intelligence Scale, or MIS, is the key example here. It uses 12 different tasks to assess the different branches of EI.
You mentioned the contempt example earlier, identifying it by combining disgust and anger. What other kinds of tasks are on the MIS?
Things like identifying emotions in faces, abstract designs, even music. Understanding how emotions blend and change over time, figuring out effective ways to manage emotions in social scenarios. Importantly, a lot of these tasks don't rely heavily on, say, vocabulary.
And what did the research using the mice show? Did it support EI as a distinct ability?
Well, analysis of the mice data suggested an overall general factor of EI, plus 3 subfactors matching perception, understanding, and regulation of emotion, maybe a weaker fourth for integrating emotion and thought. The test scores showed good reliability, and crucially, they correlated significantly, though modestly, with verbal intelligence and self-reported empathy. This suggests to you that EI, measured by mice, is related to but not the same as traditional verbal smarts.
But the paper also brings up some skepticism, right? A counter-argument from a 1998 study.
That's right. Davies, Stankoff, and Roberts raised concerns about whether EI was truly unique and if the measurements were sound. They worried that self-report questionnaires, which were common then, were maybe just measuring existing personality traits with a new label. They also questioned the reliability of earlier attempts at objective measures, some precursors to the maze. It's important to remember, though, their study came out before the more developed maze was widely published.
So even around 2000, there was still debate in the scientific community about the validity of EI as a distinct intelligence.
Yeah.
It definitely complicates the idea that it just automatically underpins SEL.
Exactly. The paper concludes for you that whether it's reasonable to say EI underlies SEL really hinges on whether the scientific community broadly accepts EI as a valid and distinct part of personality.
Okay, let's move to the second assumption. How does EI relate to success? This was a huge selling point in the popular hype.
Yeah, the paper points out that back in the early 2000s, there wasn't actually a ton of published research specifically looking at what the ability-based version of EI predicts in terms of life outcomes. Studies using tools like the Mayas were still pretty new.
But they did mention some early hints.
They do mention some preliminary evidence suggesting a link between doing well on tasks, measuring emotion perception similar to some Mies tasks, and a lower chance of being involved in things like violent and drug-related behaviors.
That's interesting. But the paper also really critiques that broader, popularized definition of EI, the one including motivation, social skills, all that stuff.
Precisely. The authors argue for you that when you define EI so broadly to include this huge range of personality traits, you're basically just doing standard personality research. Sure, they agree a collection of those variables can predict life outcomes, but calling it emotional intelligence doesn't really add anything new or particularly insightful.
And they question the claim that these specific traits within that broad definition are somehow uniquely powerful predictors of success.
Yes. They reference a quote from Epstein suggesting there's not much evidence for a single underlying factor within that big collection of traits that dramatically boosts success. They use the example of the big five trait, agreeableness. It was largely unrelated to job success in a huge study, despite Goldman emphasizing handling relationships. Similarly, being extroverted doesn't consistently predict success across different jobs.
So these broadly defined EI traits aren't reliable rockstar predictors on their own. What about positive feelings? Does being happy help?
The paper notes that when traits like positive feelings do predict success, the effect is usually quite small, explaining only maybe 2–3% of the differences between people. That's way less than traditional measures of general intelligence, which can predict maybe 10–25% of academic performance. They also suggest that in studies using self-report EI skills that show positive outcomes, it might actually be the underlying happiness or positive mood doing the heavy lifting, not some distinct EI factor.
And what about those crazy high percentages Goldman claiming EI predicts up to 80% of success? The paper addresses that, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The authors tackle that early claim head-on, referencing critiques of that kind of broad statement. They also analyze his later claim from '98 that EI predicts 67% of workplace success based on finding emotional competencies in job descriptions. The paper points out for you that this high percentage isn't surprising given Goldman's super broad definition, which included like 25 different socio-emotional skills.
Right. If you define EI to include almost any desirable trait, then of course it looks important for jobs. But as the paper emphasizes, just because employers list a bunch of nice characteristics doesn't automatically mean having all those traits guarantees success for an employee.
Exactly. The paper stresses the need for rigorous science to figure out which specific traits actually lead to success in different jobs, rather than just relying on wish lists. The authors conclude those popular claims about EI being twice as important as IQ are likely way overblown. Established personality research is probably more informative on success factors. However, they do reiterate that ability-based EI research suggests modest but potentially important links to outcomes like reduced problem behaviors.
That's a really crucial distinction.
Okay.
Okay, moving to assumption 3. Is EI central to character? This seems key for justifying its use in character programs.
The paper explains that while the initial academic writings on ability-based EI sometimes associate it with character attributes, that emphasis was later dialed back. Intelligence, including EI, is generally seen as a capacity you can use for various purposes, good or bad, really. They use optimism as an example, pointing out it's influenced by biology, experiences, learned styles. EI is only one piece of that puzzle.
And what about the link between ability-based EI and other personality traits? Are they just measuring the same things?
The research back then suggested they were relatively independent. Measures of ability-based EI had generally low correlations, usually below 0.40, with many established personality traits. This suggests EI, measured by ability tests, wasn't just, repackaging existing personality concepts.
The paper also makes a really interesting point about EI not just being about having good feelings all the time.
That's a crucial distinction for you to grasp. They argue a healthy learning environment needs critical thinking, even debate, not just constant positivity. In fact, emotionally intense material, positive or negative, can actually be more memorable.
That makes sense.
Plus, mood variations can encourage different perspectives, even boost creativity. So that simplistic idea that high EI automatically equals good citizen gets challenged.
And the paper critiques some self-report measures, like the emotional quotient inventory, for focusing almost entirely on positive traits like optimism and assertiveness, maybe without fully addressing how we cope with negative stuff.
Exactly. The author suggests you could probably have good character, follow social norms, act ethically even without scoring super high on EI measures. And conversely, having high ability-based EI doesn't automatically make you a person of good character. The relationship is complex and was still an open question for research back then.
Which leads us neatly to the fourth assumption. Is EI something you can readily teach in schools? This is a core argument for putting it in the curriculum.
The paper makes a really fundamental point here. They argue it doesn't really make sense to teach an intelligence, which is usually seen as a capacity for learning.
Hmm.
What policymakers likely meant, they suggest, was teaching emotional knowledge and skills. They agree that teaching in the area of understanding and managing emotions, what we generally call SEL now, is definitely possible.
So the wording matters. We're not really teaching emotional intelligence itself, but specific skills and knowledge about emotions.
Precisely. The authors conclude for you that while directly boosting EI as a basic capacity through teaching wasn't well supported, SEL is a more accurate term for what educators were aiming for. However, and this is a big however, they also stress that back in 2000, we didn't really know how much SEL programs actually improved school performance or behavior. There just weren't enough rigorous outcome studies yet.
So even if we could teach emotional skills, we didn't have strong proof back then that it was leading to significantly better educational results.
That's the critical point the paper makes about the state of the research at that time.
Yeah. Okay, finally, the paper asks, is emotional intelligence important in education at all, even if some early claims were overhyped?
Well, despite all the critiques, the authors do concede that the concept of EI, even the popular version, broadened our understanding of being smart. It acknowledges for you that people sometimes labeled overly sensitive or bleeding hearts are actually processing important emotional information. This wider view can help educators see the whole student better, recognizing that information in education has both cognitive and emotional sides.
That seems like a valuable takeaway, even if the initial excitement and policy perhaps got a bit ahead of the solid science.
Absolutely. The paper concludes by summarizing for you that the educational policies around EI in the early 2000s seemed more driven by popular science journalism than by the still developing scientific research. While ability-based EI had some initial support and offered a new perspective, the broader, popularized versions lacked clear definitions and strong predictive evidence, especially compared to traditional IQ and personality research. The link to character was complex, not a direct equivalence. And while teaching emotional knowledge, SEL, was feasible, its actual impact needed much more investigation.
It really brings us back to that cautionary tale of the self-esteem movement, doesn't it?
Ugh.
It's a powerful reminder about the risks of basing huge educational policies on ideas that sound good but aren't yet firmly grounded in solid scientific findings.
Exactly. The authors offer a forward look, suggesting that if the science of EI continues to develop rigorously, it could offer valuable insights into how SEL programs work and how to integrate them effectively. They even propose it might re-legitimize areas like the liberal and creative arts, which often inherently foster emotional reasoning and understanding.
That's a really interesting thought. A more scientifically solid EI could actually strengthen the case for subjects exploring human emotions and experiences.
It leads to a final thought for you to really mull over. Think about this historical pattern in education. We tend to focus on single aspects of the mind, behaviorism, then effective education, cognitive skills, self-esteem, then EI. What if new integrations in personality psychology offer a chance to move beyond this, towards a more holistic, balanced approach to educating the whole person, instead of latching onto one, sometimes vaguely defined concept like EI? It really makes you ponder how this history might inform current trends and maybe your own understanding of learning and development.